Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about different aspects of Canadian culture and history and politics and whatever basically comes to my fancy in a particular moment. And this week, because Mac is not here because of scheduling conflicts, I thought it would be kind of interesting to just briefly talk about the early days of national broadcasting, in part because I genuinely think it's overall interesting as a topic, right? And one that we don't necessarily consider because it was a surprising hassle to actually set up what we now know as like the CBC or Radio Canada and all of that. But also because I guess it's unfortunately, perhaps fortunately, I don't know, a topical discussion to have, right? Because we have politicians arguing as to whether or not that is a valid thing to have now, right? Is something like the CBC or a national broadcasting. I think so, but yeah, it's an interesting topic to discuss. That being said, um, I do want to start off this particular episode by, of course, thanking everyone who supports the show and who makes it possible. So if you want to help support the show for as little as $1 or $3 a month, you can do so by signing up to our Patreon, and we get access to early episodes and even extra episodes that are more pop culture based. So thank you very much to all our supporters over there. And yeah, there's a new episode of Pop Canada coming soon. We're a bit behind, but it's coming. Okay, so let's get started. The history of Canadian broadcasting, you know, despite us having an image of it being a mostly public thing as far as like a national broadcasting service is concerned, actually started off in the very private hands of individual business owners. And by the 1920s, right, or by the end of the 1920s, there were already about 80 stations that were operating in Canada, mostly in the larger cities, right? So by the 1920s, that would have been, of course, like Montreal, Halifax, Toronto, that type of thing. Um, and actually, you know, despite what some people might expect, there were some that were in, some outer regions, although, of course, most of them were short on revenue and could only, provide mediocre programming because if you think radio has a lot of difficulty now, imagine in the early days of the 1920s when no one was doing it or very few people were doing it. And, you know, the early days, and this is again something that you'd see as a recurring topic in Canadian content, I guess, right? And again, it's something that you still hear today. But a lot of the shows that Canadians were producing in those early days, whether it's private or what would become the publicly owned radio stations, were often very unfavorably compared to the American stations across the border, which a lot of Canadians would receive, especially when they were close to the border, which most Canadians were, um, because already by then, the American stations had a lot more budget, had been established for a lot longer, and so could compete in this like early day free market Wild West that was the radio industry, right? And so it kind of forced a lot of Canadian, radio creators to try to, actually improve their work and to come together into making something interesting. And that's really where our story begins. Now, from the early days, right, in the 1920s, whether it was private or what would become the public broadcasting networks, the radio development was regulated in Canada by the radio branch of the Department of Marine and Fisheries, right, in part because that was what it was most used for, right, actually communicating with ships and so on to ensure safety and proper functioning of that particular area of the Canadian state and industry. But obviously, what you have access to in Canada is, of course, a network of trains, right? It was something that very early on in obviously Canada's history, we tried to develop as part of our national identity, right? In a way of creating a national cohesion, right? The Great Railway Station. Um, Now, what's interesting is that what became the Canadian Railway, right, company, right, or the Canadian National Railway, was actually coalesced into what we know it today, right, in the 1920s, right around the time when that whole discussion around what to do with national radio and radio content was also being developed. And what you start to see early on is actually a connection between the railway system in Canada and the radio system. And you can see this as early as the 1927, when as we're trying to develop more and more of these industries, right, or a more cohesive and national radio station that can be heard across all kinds of Canadian provinces and cities, what you start to see is that we're using the trains in order to actually send out radio broadcasts across the whole country, right? Sometimes the same broadcast was sent across one railway station because you actually could, right? So you basically started broadcasting from a radio station from one train station, and then as the train moved forward across the country, the broadcast would follow, with the time zone. It's very interesting stuff. And a really good example of this is in 1927, when basically, to make a long story short, a new method of multi-channel transition was being developed for long distance lines, right? Which had by this time started to have sometimes their own individual radio stations, mostly as a way of attracting tourists and so on, or promoting ads for themselves, right? So they use the radio for that. And basically, what happened with the train stations is that you created a broadcasting network, right? To use a more contemporary term, of interconnected stations. And during the Diamond Jubilee of Canada's Confederation on the 1st of July, 1927, one of the first broadcasts, right, on a transcontinental scope was actually suggested by the Association of Canadian Clubs, which is, you know, spectacular to think about. It's almost nothing today when you think about it with the internet or very powerful radio stations, but at the time it was really ambitious, right? Although feasible. And basically, after months of planning and weeks of testing, there was this broadcasting that took place and emanated from Parliament Hill in Ottawa. And there were choirs and musicians, there were actresses and actors singing and performing all kinds of different, how could I say, all kinds of different uh, productions, right? And all of this was basically intercut with speeches by governor generals, like at that time it would have been Lord Willingdon, as well as, of course, the prime minister of the time, Mackenzie King. Um, and basically, this very special broadcast was given in three segments, from 10:45 in the morning until 9:30 at night. And shockingly, for the time, it was actually quite successful, right? And basically solidified in that moment the possibility of creating a national broadcasting channel. Now, despite this kind of one-off and really spectacular way of actually putting into place some kind of transcontinental radio broadcast, by and large, you'd still stay with relatively local radio stations, right? Um, and it was only the year after, in the early days of 1928, that the radio branch of the Department of Marine and Fisheries, which, as I mentioned before, was the regulating body behind radio, basically caused a stir that would lead to the government or the Royal Commission that would look into the state of Canadian radio, right? Basically, they refused to renew the licenses of 5 radio stations that were owned by a religious organization, which now holds the name of the Jehovah's Witnesses, but at the time held a different name, and I forget what it is off the top of my head. Um, and basically, they had refused these licenses because of the so-called anti-establishment sermons that they were broadcasting. Now, if you think that we're having discussions today about free speech, it basically blew up into a whole debate in the House of Commons about free speech, right? Why are you silencing this particular religious group and not others, and so on? And that is when the Liberal government, which was in power at the time, created a royal commission, right, to look into the general state of Canadian radio. Now, the commission was chaired by Sir John Aird, alongside 2 men called Charles Bowman and Augustin Frigon, and it held several months of hearings and produced a shockingly brief report, actually, in late 1929, um, that basically tried to convince the Canadian government that a national network was needed as a way of providing Canadian programs for Canadian listeners, um, first as a way to stop the encroachment of American networks, but also to create some kind of standard that could regulate and avoid certain controversies like had just happened with the once and future Jehovah's Witnesses. Um, Now, at this time, that was a radical recommendation, right? The creation of a government company to control and run all Canadian broadcasting is something that today might seem, relatively part of certain Canadian standards, right? It's something that you still hear somewhat today, but at the time it was really something new. And what happened is that the government actually did accept some form of this and basically compensated or bought out the private stations that were around at the time and put them under the banner of um, not the Canadian Broadcasting Company um, or corporation, sorry, but something akin to it, or basically the government body. Unfortunately, shortly after the Aird report, as it was known, was released, the Depression began because it was the late 1920s, and the Liberals were very quickly voted out of office. And here's what's surprisingly shocking, right, is that the Conservative government that replaced the Liberals shockingly didn't file the report away into the great hall of abandoned recommendations and reports that Canadian government has in its Royal Commission mausoleum, and actually continued um, along with this particular project, which is very interesting considering the Great Depression tightened everyone's belts, right? And a huge part of the reason why they didn't is because of the lobbying efforts of what became known as the Canadian Radio League, which in part was spearheaded by certain nationalist activists like Graham Spry and Alan Blount, and they actually championed public ownership of broadcasting um, because they didn't want the commercialized American radio style, right, as they perceived it. And at this time, what they managed to do is pretty much successfully remind the new prime minister, who was Bennett at the time, R.B. Bennett, of the political potential of a national radio network and the dangers of Americanization. So, despite the tight purses that would have been, present in the Great Depression, the political advantages of a national radio is what convinced Bennett to keep going with it. And if you want it summed up, right, Graham Spry had a really famous aphorism concerning radio, and he kind of created this false dichotomy where he said that the choice was between the state and the United States. which I think is very snappy, and it managed to convince the Canadian public. Now, despite initial intentions of buying up smaller companies and so on, a full on government monopoly was too much for the now conservative parliament to swallow. And by the time that the Radio Broadcasting Act of 1932 actually created a public broadcaster, which at the time was called the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, they simultaneously did allow for private stations to continue to coexist alongside this commission, as well as its successor, which we now know as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which was formally created in 1936. Now, both the CRBC and the current CBC were funded until 1952 by the income from license fees paid by each set owner, right? As well as slight advertising income. But, the government was always a little bit uneasy about actually using advertising income, in part because of the actual mandate of the CBC or CRBC in its early days of being staunchly anti American, right? Which in a lot of Canadians' minds was very corporatist and had a lot of ads, and that was not the goal of the CBC, basically. Right? It was mostly there as a way of providing Canadians with culture and information and the basic necessities of what they perceived as life being in the early 20th century. Right? Um, and so, because of that, the actual revenues of the public broadcaster were relatively insufficient. And so, as a way of making up for the lack of funds, right? Because the actual license fees were not enough to cover um, the operating costs. Um, what often happened is that you had affiliation agreements that were worked out with private stations, whereby they carried a certain number of CBC and CRBC programs, which were early in their career, right, and early in their creation, actually recognized for their quality, right? Like they actually did what they were supposed to do, which is provide quality content for Canadians. Um, and so basically, they managed to make back their money through licensed public broadcasting, right? Um, and the introduction of Canadian public broadcasting as a result, right, coming as it did pretty much 10 years after 10 years of private sector development, um, created, I guess, a quintessentially Canadian thing of a compromised, right? A mixed system, if you will, that the CRBC slash CBC ran on national networks and had a regulatory authority over all stations. Um, and at the same time allowed for private radio to survive and flourish, right? As it still does today. Well, flourish is a big word because who listens to radio anymore, or very few people listen to radio. But you know, for a long time, that was a thing, which is kind of ironic considering that by the time the CBC and all of that was running into full swing, you would start to see the development of television, which a lot of people announced as the death of radio, which is not quite true, but it is ironic. Now, I want to stop here for a second and give some examples of some early important broadcasters, right? As a way of exemplifying what people were doing with the medium of radio at the time, because it wasn't just music and news, as you might expect, or as you often see um, on the radio today. And it wasn't either just talk radio, as you would also see today. So, one of the examples that I like to pull from whenever I'm talking about early Canadian radio is William Rowan, who was a ranch pupil who grew up observing the wildlife on the Canadian prairies and would go on to study zoology at the University College London. Later, he would actually teach zoology during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s at the University of Alberta. and he would actually conduct pioneering research on bird migration. Um, what's kind of interesting about William Rowan is that starting in the 1920s, he would actually start a weekly radio broadcast on conservation that reached a rather wide audience across the prairies. And immediately after the war, his concerns, about scientists' responsibility to society were published in the popular press and disseminated on a widely listened to radio show. And I just like to point to um, this example of William Rowan as a way of demonstrating how the radio was used for very important information, right? About conservation and a general interest in how life in Canada actually operated and what needed to happen or change in, in this case, the prairies. But you could see shows like this all across Canada. And the so-called Doc Rowan, as his radio personality would have it, would go on to actually have a major impact on his colleagues, students, and general public, right? And would basically inform how radio was done, at least like the so-called talk radio, if you want to call it that, was done for a long time in Canada. And if you want another example as well of what was used is, of course, for sports and entertainment. So I mentioned music before, and it was something that was done in the early days of radio with the Jubilee that I talked about earlier. But of course, one would be remiss if we didn't talk about hockey, right? Famously, we have a broadcaster in Canada. He's long dead now. We had a broadcaster in Canada called Foster Hewitt. Now, even if you haven't heard the name of Foster Hewitt, you have certainly heard his influence because everyone uses his famous catchphrase, he shoots, he scores, which he first said in 1933. Now, Foster Hewitt is kind of interesting. He actually um, had a job at the Independent Telephone Company as a radio manufacturer. And he would leave that job and university when his own father, who was the sports editor at the Toronto Daily Star, um, told him that the Star was going to start its own radio station. Now, Hewitt had become a reporter at the paper and was basically ready to go onto the air when the CFCA was launched, which was the Toronto Daily Star's um, radio station. Now, that first broadcast from the CFCA was done in 1923, although it was Norman Albert and not Foster Hewitt that would ultimately go on and who performed the play-by-play. Um, but Foster Hewitt would go on and do the play-by-play the week after, right, and would continue to do so for many, many years. Right? Um, and it's actually a subject to historical debate whether or not Hewitt was there on February 16th, because there's a bit of debate as to whether or not there was a hockey game that day. It doesn't matter. Early on in 1923, Foster Hewitt started, and he would basically create what we would know as hockey announcements on media that we still use to this day. Right? So again, very important to highlight um, how radio shapes the way that we talk about certain things to this day. Um, Hewitt is actually important in other sports. It's said that he and his father would go on to do the first broadcast of a horse race in 1925, and he was actually a guest announcer. He was invited as a guest announcer to broadcast the first game from the new Detroit Olympia when it opened in 1927. So, very important fellow, and another example to highlight how early days radio uh, was used for all kinds of purposes. I want to end today with a little bit of a return to some of the issues of advertising that I mentioned at first, um, because that would kind of inform how national broadcasting would uh, kind of organize itself and think of itself going forward. Now, broadcast advertising began very early on, right? In the early days, right, you had radio stations in Montreal like XWA that would promote the Canadian Marconi Company during its radio programs. And by 1928, you know in the early days of national broadcasting, advertisers were pushing all kinds of goods and services on the air, buying radio time just as you would buy newspaper space. And of course, instead of using images and symbols, you were using music and sound effects to capture attention, which, again, pretty much as you would today. Um, Funny enough, radio advertising was almost banned in 1922 because of concerns that the Canadian public had over false claims and poor taste, which, again, very much rings of modern sensibilities, right? But a lot of listeners and legislators were very reluctant to pay directly for their programs. So this whole um, discussion of paying for ad-free content, um, seems to be hundreds of years old at this point. Um, and so both the public and private broadcasters in Canada automatically grew dependent on advertising revenue. And this persisted until roughly the mid 50s, when television rapidly overtook other media as a popular source of information and entertainment. And so, what happened is that a lot of advertisers and agents adapted film techniques to produce commercials for television. And basically, with the revenue that they made for television programming, and advertising, they were able to slowly drop the number of ads that were happening on the radio because, especially something like the CBC and Radio Canada, it was all related, right? So the ad revenue from one allowed another to be compensated for. And so basically, what happened is that in the in CBC radio, right? Um, with the rise of television and so on, they were able to, or they made the decision, whether it was a financially sound decision or not, leaves people to question that. But CBC Radio decided to be completely commercial free since 1975. Um, and part of that, um, part of that is actually part of the debate that you see, and that is related, I should say, to the debate that you see today about CBC, which um, continues to see severe cutbacks to its budget since the 90s, and a drop in listenership and viewership, both with CBC Radio and CBC Television. And so a lot of the discussion about whether or not we should be funding the CBC entirely or should use advertising revenue in order to supplement what is basically a dying channel to a lot of people's eyes, um, started in the 1960s and 70s, right, when these types of decisions were made. Right. Um, and yeah, I don't know how best to end this because we could go on and on about different programs that the CBC has produced. But I just wanted to do this episode as a way of talking a little bit about how the early days of the CBC were set up and why I think it was important for so many people for so long, because it was a genuine source of information and creativity and an explosion of how Canadians perceive themselves, right? And I think that's most aptly represented in the early connections between radio and the railway, which for a long time was the symbol of Canadian identity, right? Which I find very interesting to consider. Should it be completely defunded and you know, deconstructed? I don't think so. I think the CBC, for what it represents, despite all its faults, is very interesting and deserves the funding that it gets, right? And ultimately, that funding is a drop in the bucket. which I guess is my lukewarm way of ending this episode. I don't know how else to end it. It's an interesting topic to consider, and hopefully you learned something about the early days of radio broadcasting. I don't know. Um, Maybe we'll do future episodes about particular programs that I think are cool or Mac thinks are cool. I don't know. But ultimately, this was it. I just wanted to talk about this for a second, just end on a bit of a lukewarm ending of don't defund it because it has some cultural value, right? Um, so anyway, if you want to support the show, like I said at the start, you can consider checking out our Patreon. Otherwise, just leave a 5-star review or anything like that. You know the drill. People listen to content. And yeah, listen to your local CBC or do whatever you want. I don't care. Send us an email if you want about either future topics that we can cover or anything like that, and I'll be happy to read it and respond. We got some great reviews last week. We've been getting more and more people commenting on our YouTube videos, which are the same as our regularly scheduled programming, but on YouTube, and people have been responding more. So thank you to everyone who's been doing that. And yeah, just overall, thank you. And have a lovely whatever you're having. Cheers, everyone.
Vacation starts with VA. One thing you'll love about your trip to Virginia is that you'll never have to settle for one thing. All that you love is all in one trip. Start yours at virginia.org.
Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Peer Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.